Next of Kin is about the importance of the family in Chicano cultural politics, that is, different forms of cultural expression since the 1960s, and looking at the way that the family has been wedded to patriarchal heteronormative value systems, but also the way that it's been reconfigured by queer cultural workers, writers, and theorists. So thinking about the family in its traditional manifestations, but also taking account of the way that it's been reconceptualized since the 1960s.
So both looking back and looking forward, would you say?
Exactly. It's grounded historically, but it also gestures towards the future, right? What the family has to offer, and how changes in the family are reflective of the way that we're starting to reassess the significance of kinship, but in ways that are different from its original manifestations in, say, the 1960s and 70s as it was produced during the Chicano movement. And the reason why I focus on the family is because there's always this contest for the different meanings of family that take place within Chicana communities. And so while the family in its more traditional sense has reproduced a normative nuclear kinship network, there are different ways to think about the family. And so using feminist and queer theory, I'm looking at the way that Chicano queer communities have also turned to the family in a way to challenge the nuclear patriarchal understandings of the family, to give it a more democratic, egalitarian view.
Can you give us an example of something that you used to look at and how it was representing the family, both maybe the traditional stance of a family and then these changes and differences of what makes up a family?
And so in the first chapter of the book, I'm looking at both visual representations of the family in Chicano movement era newspapers and journals, but it's also, it's called Reappraising the Archive, but it also looks at literary text that emerged from that period and identifying the intimately linked notions of family and machismo. And so how I end the chapter, each chapter seems to end with a queer twist, right? It starts off with a very traditional understanding of the family, but it ends by turning that traditional notion of the family on its head. So the first chapter ends by talking about the way that the term macho or machismo has been reconfigured by Chicana lesbian writers, reclaiming the term not only as a way to critique patriarchy, but as a way to rethink the idea of the family and the way that the family is intimately connected to questions of gender and sexuality. I think there's a way that Chicano identity politics has been connected to a very patriarchal value system. Not in all cases, but if you're going to ground it historically and say tracking its development since the 60s with the rise of various social movements, the politics of identity are really important and inextricably linked to questions of gender and sexuality. And so to rethink questions of identity means to rethink questions of gender and sexuality. What I'm trying to do is show that they're intimately linked, that you can't just talk about Chicano without talking about gender. Although the book is grounded historically, I think it's also important in a contemporary frame, because asking what counts as family ties into current debates about what counts as marriage, and the whole debate around gay marriage, although not addressed in the book, it's certainly related to that. I think the book is timely in that it's addressing issues that are relevant today, particularly about family values and kinship politics. And I don't think that anyone could really adhere to a normative family ideal or something called family values model, which reproduces a nuclear patriarchal family. Just because I think on the ground we live our lives in such complex ways, and it manifests in the way that we create our family networks, right? And so I think the book is trying to get at what those alternative family networks are by foregrounding queer communities, queer individuals who help reconfigure the way that we understand family, but not at the expense of including people who are, say, part of our traditional family structure. So at the end of the book, I'm thinking about the influence of queer politics on traditional families and the way that the family can be reconceptualized, not at the expense of, say, biological relatives, but to think about or to rethink the family in ways that give it a more democratic possibility where patriarchy isn't the norm of the day. When one thinks about Chicano culture, the family is always seen at the heart of Chicano culture. You know, Latinos in particular, in general I should say, are seen as the purveyors of family values, and I think politicians are always emphasizing that the family is so important to Latinos, and I think within a specific Chicano context, that's certainly the case given the way that the family is constantly invoked and represented in literature, film, other elements or aspects of visual culture. And so for me, it was both signaling the importance of the family, but at the same time critiquing the way that the family had been reproduced in these in Chicano communities in ways that weren't democratic or that weren't egalitarian around questions of gender and sexuality. Even as far back as the 60s, you can see the contestation over reifying a nuclear patriarchal family by Chicano feminist writers. And so what I do is with the help of those Chicano feminist writers, challenge the way that the family is consistently reproduced as the norm. And so by undoing those representations, showing that it's not a norm at all, but rather a politics that
that is constantly changing.
That is constantly changing, and it's been really interesting to hear the responses to the book since it's been published. Non-academic folks are reading it and telling me that they're getting a lot out of it just by bringing up issues of gender and sexuality in relation to the family. For some, it's still very taboo. Those are issues that you don't bring up, and because the family is seen as this institution that you don't mess with, by breaking these silences, I think people are really excited that the book is touching on these issues, and I see the book in conversation with recent work in queer studies, in feminist and gender studies, but also extending the work that's been done in Chicano studies, particularly by Chicano feminist writers and scholars, but also emphasizing the situation of Chicano men, Chicano gay men, Chicano gay male writers and artists. And that's, I think, one aspect that I touch on in the book that hasn't really been addressed in previous studies, and something that distinguishes it from previous works on the subject of the family.